time to jump into a best ball or resurrection draft over at underdogfantasy.com. That's what we're doing today. This will run up until the start of the first game of NFL Week 6 if it hasn't filled by that time. Myself and Shawn have just jumped in the draft room. We have picked up Shawn's spot number 8. So if you are playing over at Underdog Fantasy, you can use the code RotoViz to get a 100% sign-up bonus up to $100 while playing over there. This should be a lot of fun, Shawn, because I thought it was going to be a way that we can talk about some of the rest of season outlooks for players. So rather than just try and come up with which players we want to talk about, we'll just let the draft go as it will, and we'll talk about players along the way. So looking forward to starting this draft in 25 seconds as the clock ticks down. It literally took, I think we might have been spot number 12, Shawn, and we jumped in this. So nice when they kick off nice and fast like that. We are waiting on NFL Week 5, but it is an exciting time to be watching the games as the points continue to tally up. So hopefully, Shawn, we're going to have a team here in this $10 contest that gives us a chance to win the $30,000 top prize. It's going to be interesting to run through as we haven't looked at the ADP or anything so far in this contest, but anyone you're excited to potentially get here at the 108 to kick us off with a fun draft?
No.
Feels like this is one we're just going to see how it plays out.
One of the things that's really exciting to see, Keenan Allen, one of our top priority picks for the year, has moved from the 3-4 turn into round 1. That's a very positive development, obviously, there. It'll be interesting to see, Colm, if Jahmyr Chase, who has an ADP of 7.9, if he falls to us and if we would like him there. Certainly with T. Higgins not performing, having the rib injury, I mean, Higgins might not miss that much time, but I wouldn't expect him to be very effective. When you consider that he's now injured on top of previously being ineffective, I wrote yesterday, and we talked a lot on Stealing Bananas about the differences from this slow start for Cincinnati and previous slow starts. That said, if you were to get Chase in that range, I think that would be interesting. Austin Ekeler is going in that area. Once he comes back, it certainly seems like he's going to be a guy who is one of the biggest difference makers in fantasy, especially when we've watched how it's been, difficult for some of the other running backs to really get untracked. Obviously, the player who came out big again last night, and again, one of our priority targets, Kenneth Walker, putting up some points. So we do get to the spot. It is Austin Ekeler, Keenan Allen, A.J. Brown. We could go with Devontae Williams, a little bit of a quarterback question there. Amon-Ra, one of our guys. Cooper Kupp, potentially coming back. Colm, which direction would you like to go?
I think we'll go with Austin Ekeler, just to start it off here. He obviously won Pat Crane the big bucks last year. Maybe he'll get us into the prize money here. The interesting thing, Shawn, just with the Chargers I was thinking of there, this contest kicking off, as I mentioned, for NFL Week 6, runs through NFL Week 14, then you're into the playoff stretch at that point. But the Chargers here with that Week 5 bye, so they're obviously not in action this week. They do have the injury to the quarterback's hand. We'll see how that develops, but they will then be available for you're kind of gaining an extra week for the teams that have that Week 5 bye as you go through this, which may prove to potentially be beneficial. But with the Chargers, they have just basically stopped throwing the ball to the running back since Austin Ekeler has been unavailable. But in the game that he was available, he was, nobody's really, Christian McCaffrey level, but he was putting up those sort of numbers that you would like to see. So I think he's pretty interesting there. And based on, we're looking rest of season and we're expecting him to be back in Week 6, it isn't the case that I think that he should be discounted as much. The other part, Shawn, that's fun to run with here is looking at how the ADPs have changed and who has moved up. So you mentioned Keenan Allen. He went at the 110. It is a situation when, we talk about you and Ben in your draft when we project to round 1 and 2 of the next year's draft. Well, this is pretty much doing a similar experiment, but we're looking for 6 weeks into the season. So it should be fun to touch on some of the names that have shifted up positively in ADP. I was hoping CeeDee Lamb, Shawn, would have made it to us there at the 204. He goes one pick before. In the queue is Jaylen, Waddle, Chris Olave, Devontae Smith. We haven't hit the heights yet with Waddle, but I still think that I would like to have part of that offense. For me, it'll be between him and Devontae Smith here for which one you'd want to go for.
Colm, let's get some of that Miami Dolphins offense double down a little bit on the passing attack. Jaylen
It
Waddle,
does feel like, and
player.
people listening in may think that it does feel like a double down, because that's right where we would have been happy to take him in the regular draft portion, before. But, some of the questions that have been answered, Waddle hasn't had the start that we would have potentially hoped for him to have, based both on injury and some performance potentially as well. But a lot of questions coming into the season about Tua and how he would look. And, there's been some issues at times, but him and this offense have both looked very, very good. So to still, add in that piece in Waddle who hasn't clicked, a little bit like maybe we're looking at Ekeler with it not clicking. I think that's still the spot that he should be going. But I do think when we look at CD Lamb and Waddle, I think there's quite a gap between the 204 and the 205 there in terms of when people are drafting and where there might be tier breaks. I guess the case for Jaylen Waddle, Shawn, is still the case that we had in the offseason. I'm sure there's people listening that may not be comfortable with that spot where he's still going. But what are your thoughts there? And then after that, we'll get your thoughts on the 209, Mr. Puka.
Well, we haven't gotten the points that you wanted from Waddle, and you have that injury. But we're now in the best of best case scenarios for that Miami Dolphins offense. Yeah. The only thing that has potentially caused a little bit of a problem now is that Devin Achane is so good that they may end up being another one of these teams that scores more rushing touchdowns than you would really like. One of the things that we saw last night in Seattle is that you get another one of these games where Jackson Smith and Jigba doesn't really do anything, but it's so bad for the other two guys as well. We talked about how he was probably the guy who could end up being valuable. That doesn't look remotely like the case at this juncture. And yet he ties for the team lead in targets. For all the talk about how he's used underneath, the difference in air yards between the three players, not that significant. It was kind of funny because you have Drew Luck go in there, Drew Lock, and immediately targets JSN in a couple of spots that were sort of interesting. Sometimes you just need a different quarterback look. But when we're thinking about these teams who are scoring too many rushing touchdowns, that's more of an issue for me than say, Tyreek Hill is playing really well. That I don't think is a problem at all. This Miami offense is going to score so many points, and you contrast it with the other guy that we passed on there. So, Devontae Smith, I think, a very good pick. Chris Olave, he scored a lot more points, obviously, than Waddle. He has looked better, and yet their situation is much more troubling, where the quarterback play is not any good. And you have a game last week where Rashid Shaheed gets more targets. He ties with Michael Thomas. They're all doubled up by Alvin Kamara. I think that the structural risks in that Saints offense are more significant. You mentioned that Puka goes there early. That hard to fault at this point in time.
Yeah, and we're one pick away, Shawn. I would like to see DeAndre Swift fall to us here, but we may have a choice between him and Etienne. Mark Andrews would be available potentially at tight end, but I think Swift would be somebody nice to add. Anyone else? Achane, obviously, you can slot him in there as well if you want. Swift did go off the board. I may have cursed ourselves there, but maybe this is somewhere where we could potentially just load up on Dolphins. So you could potentially take an Achane here and then, on the wraparound, potentially even look at a Tua, for example, who's going in that next range. I think, Shawn made that decision before I had to make a monologue. Achane is the pick. Achane over Etienne. Any closeness there in your thoughts?
I think it's close. I think that there is the emotional temptation right now to overstate the value of these most recent games. And yet, I wrote in the Monday article that we continue to see these echoes of Chris Johnson. When we think about best ball, we're looking
Shawn,
at
they're sneaking onto social media. Let me tell you that the CJ2K comparisons. I'm seeing that popping up.
Very nice. Yeah, when you look at how the spike weeks are going to help your advance, help your win, all of those things, I think, very, very positive when we think through how this is going to develop. And so from those perspectives, And again, you get the fumbles for Mostert, you get the shift in the snap counts last week. I don't necessarily think that in a blowout, you're looking at those things as being overly definitive. And yet, I mean, he looks really, really good. And so we add to our Dolphins exposure. I think all of that is positive. I would have liked to have gotten Jonathan Taylor as we came back through there. But Colm, you had mentioned Tua. I think that would be an option. There's the gross option of David Montgomery or Kyron Williams. You can take your Green Bay Packers receiver in Christian Watson, James Cook, Sam Laporta.
I would like to. I think we load up here. We take two, and we see. I think Laporta would be a nice move then in the next round. That gives us a Dolphin start along with Austin Ekeler. So it's going to take me a while to get out of the Achane. Obviously, we've been updated now. It is Achane. It felt like when Ben said on Seed and Bananas that he didn't know which way to pronounce it, that the team and Achane himself decided that they would make an announcement just for Ben, but they have come out and said it. So it'll take a while to get used to saying that, but it is Austin Ekeler to Achane, and then we have mixed in Jaylen Waddle. So fun start. Week 10, Shawn, maybe somewhere we now look to avoid in some of these cases for the Dolphins. Been heavy in that scenario, and I think then, it's this long since we were doing Best Ball Mania drafts that I think it's important maybe to take a look ahead here to see. Do you remember, Shawn, who the Dolphins have in week 17?
Well, yeah, got the Baltimore Ravens.
Okay, so Shawn has that done already. So it looks like we won't get Laporta. Maybe we will. We'll see. It's going to be just slightly after ADP. He would be a fun one to add into this roster at the tight end position. But I think it's set up pretty nicely so far. Shawn, some of the players that dropped quite a bit in ADP, we have T. Higgins at the 4.7, and I believe it was around the maybe the 4.4 that was where Garrett Wilson went off the board. They feel pretty fair at those spots. That feels appropriate. Would you be still taking them higher than that, or is that where you think they would go? And would you take Higgins over Wilson at this point based on
No, I mean, I think that Garrett Wilson is still very draftable there. We finally saw a borderline competent or at least interesting game from Zach Wilson. There's still the possibility that they end up with a different quarterback at some point. So you have multiple paths where maybe that could work out. And Garrett Wilson is clearly a superstar who is going to be the target hog in that offense. I mean, T. Higgins wasn't playing well before he fractured his rib, right? And I mean, Joe Burrow looks absolutely awful. Now, it's within context, right? There's a big difference between him looking awful and these guys who are taking a sack on every play. And yet, even when you sort of adjust for some of those differences, then his level of play is so poor. I don't think that T. Higgins could be drafted anywhere in that vicinity. Now, I'm going to be sending out some dynasty trade offers in leagues where I have a heavy concentration of players who have been injured or underperformed / that kind of combination to try and pick him up and move some older guys who have some value right away. I'm not giving up on him for the long term. I still think that you have to give him credit for what he's done to this point. He's a big time talent, but we can't ignore what's happened to this point in the season either, especially when we're thinking about a short sprint tournament where we need points, right? And so I don't think you can give all of that away by going for him still at what are fairly lofty prices.
Yeah, and the Garrett Wilson one obviously hurts, and the Breece Hall situation has hurt through 4 weeks based on the Rodgers injury in the very first game, and that has been tough. But T. Higgins has been somebody that, on my safe flyers and off, I was hoping we would get him through there, Shawn. That would be nice. We are on the clock, but I was going to say the T. Higgins stuff has been tough over the last 2 seasons. We are on the clock, Shawn. Hit me with some of your favorite potential names here. I was just touching on Breece Hall. He is in this range. Jahmyr Gibbs is in this range.
Yeah, I think that Gibbs is a lot better bounce back sort of explosion play than some of those other names. I also think Chris Godwin is a really nice pick here, but we can probably get him through. You comfortable with Gibbs?
Yep. So Gibbs is the pick. The just for people who may be listening along and maybe in some of their draft rooms themselves. For you, is if it's a 1v1, would you take Gibbs over Flowers? And then if it's in this particular situation where it's a Dolphins led team, would you take him in that situation if you wouldn't take him in a 1v1?
Well, I guess I have a little bit more concern with Flowers in this specific format. I think you can kind of get yourself tied in knots worrying about that too much. And yet, when you think through how they're using him with just a flurry of targets at the line of scrimmage in every game, you're going to have that neutralized to an extent because of the half PPR. And then
do you think that potentially expands as the season moves along, that rather than targeting on the line of scrimmage, they start to move it a little bit downfield?
I mean, you'd like to think, but again, there were flaws in Zay Flowers' prospect profile, right? I mean, he was not one of these guys who came in as a lock. You would basically say that he's performing toward the top end, at least in terms of drawing targets. You don't really like what the targets look like. The issue that we get there then is that last week illustrated with Mark Andrews, who is likely to score the touchdowns in this offense, which Lamar Jackson and Mark Andrews are the guys. That's not to say that someone who has a good start to his year, like Zay Flowers, which he has had, that couldn't evolve into something a lot more exciting as we go along. So I'm certainly not saying to avoid him, but I don't know that his price is really that encouraging in terms of what it leaves for him to outperform. I think it's a little bit more emotion and enthusiasm based than someone who could really come through. And we see Chris Godwin in the last game. He has that buy that you discussed. And so Godwin here would be an interesting play in that you're not going to lose a game from him. I also think Terry McLaurin here is actually a really good pick.
Let's do Godwin and hope McLaurin could sneak around. I don't think he will, but I'm interested to play out this. Week 5, Shawn, might have no bearing on how things work out here, but I do think it's interesting to have a player who has cleared his bye week and would be available. There's bound to be, you're just looking for as many potential pathways as possible, and there's a chance that Chris Godwin gets injured in week 6 and misses the rest of it, for example, similar with Austin Ekeler. But a few years ago, we had the situation where, with week 13 buys and the FFPC, it meant you would have Jonathan Taylor for the additional weekend season. You would miss him for the first week of the playoffs. But having those points potentially available to you is beneficial in obviously this situation. Shawn, Terry McLaurin did not make it back to us, obviously. 12 picks later, he goes 3 selections later. Interested in how close was that for you? And then how did Breece Hall potentially factor into that situation, who went 2 picks after us?
Yeah, Breece Hall is it's so demoralizing. I don't think there's any great way to put a positive spin on it. I would think that the best way to put a positive spin on it would simply say that, he again looks so good. And I don't think that Dalvin Cook is completely washed or is a bad player. I'd be much less surprised for him to play somewhere next year and reemerge and be a difference maker than a lot of these other guys that teams seem to be betting on.
That was a bad signing for the Jets, though.
Oh, and it's a terrible signing. It never made any sense. And so you look at that, because Abanikanda would do the same types of things, and you develop your roster, which is always what you're trying to do. And it's one of the reasons why this whole pathway with Aaron Rodgers was, vaguely demoralizing even before he got hurt, right? Think of a more creative and more productive way to go about it. But you get in this situation now, and yeah, you would expect that his role is going to expand significantly. But now that we have to bet on 2 things happening, 1, the role expanding, and 2, the offense being functional simultaneously, that's a lot more than just saying, is he going to be good, which was the main question starting the season. He's answered that very definitively. Like, he's a superstar, but you got to use him. The offense has to be borderline viable. We don't really have those elements in place. And so again, one of the things I think that we look at here is when a guy falls 3 or 4 rounds from the preseason price, you're thinking, okay, well, this is a great time to buy. I don't know that you want to look at it that way. It's like, who are the players who are the best values now, right? Because a 3-round fall in different sections of the draft can overstate how much actual new value you're getting.
Yeah, and situational based. There's some players, let's say not specifically Austin Ekeler, but he's still going where he was before the season started. And I don't like we've seen what the week 1 outcome was. I don't think we should be seeing him. But there's other players who may just not have hit potentially the heights that we're hoping they would hit through those opening weeks. And I think that there could be some discounts that would potentially work out there. Shawn, one of the players you've added to the queue is Romeo Doubs. You mentioned Watson for the Packers, and he kind of tends to be the one that has come up in conversations more so on the show. I have to say that obviously he started the season himself with an injury and has now looks to be kind of pretty close to 100% at this point. But the Packer that I would be targeting would be Doubs. I think he has looked really good so far, and we haven't really talked about him. Have you had any thoughts on him, and would he be a target here for you?
Yeah,
I do think Myers probably would be the one I would go for, but hit me with your Doubs thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, Jakobi Meyers has looked really, really good. We don't necessarily know about the quarterback situation. And I would say that if you're going to have some... I mean, this Raiders team is so bad, and I think that the rookie looked interesting enough in the second half. It was really very much a tale of two halves, where the first half completely overmatched, and you're like, I mean, he's going to wipe out Devontae Adams in this game. And then the second half leads the comeback. You can see the arm strength, the accuracy, the decision-making. I mean, it's not like a regular NFL starter yet. You're talking about a rookie playing in his first game. And yet the dynamism was there that if they get where it looks like they're going, you could have him as the quarterback in the postseason, the fantasy postseason, that is. And I guess that probably pushes me off of Jakobi Meyers there. The things that I was saying about the Packers offense after the first couple of weeks does look pretty accurate, and Jordan Love has not been particularly good in the subsequent games. And yet you still like the coaching. You still like how they're moving the ball. You love what Romeo Doubs is doing, who's getting open constantly.
Yeah.
He gives you that catch threat, the yardage threat. He's scored touchdowns and is a target in the red zone. I mean, he looks a consistent
red zone target throughout his 2 seasons. I thought we weren't going to have much to talk about because I thought Myers might get back to us. He doesn't. Shawn, that gives us things to talk about here. You've Justin Fields in there. I'm okay to continue to push that second quarterback, but Quinten Johnson, Deontay Johnson, and Jameson Williams. Jameson Williams might get back by ADP, but I think we do the week 5 again. We take another Charger here and we go with we do another double down here and we go for Quinten Johnson. That might be a triple down or a quadruple down at this particular point with QJ, but if you had your option, Justin Fields goes 1 pick later, would you have went with Fields there in that situation?
Not necessarily, but I have a lot more confidence. And this is kind of weird to say because generally speaking, you bet on the longer track record, you bet on the greater overall amount of talent, you bet on the talent sort of around the players. And so it's easier to think that a Joe Burrow is going to bounce back than a Justin Fields. And yet we already witnessed a bounce back game from Fields, which is very different than Joe Burrow. And the multiple paths to fantasy scoring is so important here when you're in a situation with Burrow where the injury to his teammates and the play calling, you have so many different hurdles that he has to overcome. Now, there'll probably be some games where that happens, but I guess I struggle with those two guys being so close in ADP. Fields seems like a much easier play at this point. We got that good game from DJ Moore. We got the big game from Cole Kmet. You have the obvious caveat where, the Denver Broncos look like they're going to have a historically bad defense. And yet these are the types of things that you would expect to see from Chicago. They've been so bad and their coaching has been so bad that we're probably not going to see them every week. But you saw the fluidity, you saw the looseness from Fields. There was a little bit of a thing of him just finally, I wouldn't say giving up, but you get to that point where you more or less break and then say, the heck with it, let's just play.
Let's see what happens. It felt like that.
It really did. You're going to get some long runs from him. You're going to get more rushing value than you've gotten from him to this point in the season. So I think he's an interesting play here. certainly when we're drafting a Quinten Johnston, it's not a situation where there are clear-cut other picks because, I mean, you could argue that that's going to end up being a throwaway pick. But again, I like the week 5 bye. That'll give him a chance to really work through and to get him involved. He obviously played a lot more in week 4. That was more or less guaranteed, still played way below Josh Palmer. And yet the fact that they can use him deep, that they can scheme touches to him underneath, it's always this matter of not falling into the mental trap of thinking everybody develops exactly the same way. Now, we do need to see development by the end of the year, right? We need to see Rashee Rice continue to take the next step. He's looked pretty decent, but not anything definitive yet. Obviously, you need JSN to play a lot better. You really want to see Jordan Addison do more than what he did in week 4. It wasn't a great week for the young receivers. It was another sort of blah game from Flowers, even though he's more involved. You're not giving away the whole season here. You're not saying it doesn't matter what they do, but we want to understand that not everybody is going to be Puka Nacua. And if you take a big jump in the second half of your rookie year, that would be completely within the range of appropriate, right? And exciting for the player there. So I think that Quinten Johnston gives us a lot of upside as we continue to build out this receiving room that is interesting to me, especially when we didn't go super receiver heavy early. We have Waddle, we have Godwin, we have Dobbs, we have Quinten Johnston. And again, I mean, that week 5 element that you're talking about, as long as you're not making silly picks, then I do appreciate going in that direction. Colm, as we continue to move forward here, we have another team with a week 5 bye in the Cleveland Browns. They have the QB situation. Elijah Moore.
Another team with a week 5 bye, Shawn, if you look 2 spots lower.
Oh, you're ready for us to just like jump back in on JSN as well.
We're just going to keep tripling down. There is some interesting wide receiver options here. Jahan Dotson is also somebody that's a week 14 bye, and it'll be interesting in this, to see where these guys go. So Marvin Mims is in the queue. This is based on ADP order, then Elijah Moore, then JSN. Tutu Atwell going just before that. I was quite interested to see if Jameson Williams had made it back to us. Obviously, his suspension being changed has proved obviously beneficial to his ADP here. Shawn, we have 19 seconds left. We're going to have this pick and then a pick in 7 to 8 picks time, obviously. How are you feeling here about the way, is Dotson a clear? I think Dotson is probably the clear path to actual usage, but Marvin Mims probably has the most upside. What are you thinking here?
Yeah, kind of as we talked through that, we went ahead and let it time out on Mims. I really don't know on that.
There's no reason as to why he has not been used. Even if it's a case that, let's say, he doesn't know the playbook fully, like let's just say on Wednesday of the week, you say, like, these are the 4 plays we want you to know for Sunday. We're going to hit you with a few of these. Get them out there.
Well, I mean, they've kind of been doing that, right? And he has been hitting on them. But
yeah, if
that's the case, it's like, we're going to have you practice the 20 plays that we want you to run, and exclusively those plays, and regardless of how the game develops, we're going to run those plays. I don't know. Obviously, that's not the way that it works. I do think we're going to see a big jump in the Mims snaps and the Mims routes. And again, this goes back to the prospect evaluation, where after JSN, he was the clear, he was just the clear-cut second best guy. And he's got this elite athleticism. We're playing in an NFL now where you got to have the long speed to really affect the game. Russell Wilson has looked better throwing deep than he's looked on throwing the other passes. Their running game and their defense have put them in situations where, that is going to be a big part of what they do. I think in chasing scripts, that Mims at this price, it's such an easy selection.
Yeah, another player that I was going to potentially pitch for was Jaylen Warren. He goes at the 10:03, a couple of selections, or 2 selections, before us. Elijah Moore, Shawn, you have in the queue. He is the week 5 by JSN did go 1 pick after our last selection. Dotson would be the pick here for me. Is there anyone else that is, standing out for you that would be kind of going in this next 6 pick range?
Not necessarily. I think that Charbonnet is interesting here. We have a lot of Walker. We love Walker. He's looked great, but Charbonnet in his limited touches has looked good. You again have the week 5 bye. That's a little bit less relevant in some ways for a player who isn't playing very much. But any type of Walker injury or Walker stumble, maybe had a couple bad games and has a fumble. And Charbonnet, I mean, this is the reason that he was on the 0 RB candidates countdown as well, even though the top running back on his team was, again, one of our very highest recommended players. It's that if you get the injury there, the contingency-based upside is immense. And Charbonnet himself has actually looked a little better than I was expecting. He doesn't have that ability to really move side to side, or at least he hasn't demonstrated too much of it yet. But the Seahawks have looked better as a rushing team. It's interesting, too, just the different plays and how these guys run, because Walker wants to run side to side every single play. And Charbonnet is just like, I don't have a sense of going side to side. I see this little bit of a hole here. And people always talk about the running downhill, and it's a little bit absurd, and yet
I might have got it, Shawn. This is a throwback to our Monday podcast. Isaiah Pacheco, he's running uphill. I think that's what he's doing.
That is a good one. I mean, Pacheco, it's like, I'm climbing that mountain, baby.
He's powering those legs. But anyway, back to your point.
Charbonnet really does look like, though, that he is. And every once in a while, you watch a tennis match, and the camera angle is so weird that it looks like they're playing on the side of a mountain. And you know that they're not, but the perspective is so skewed. When you watch Charbonnet run, it's sort of the opposite. Where you're like, he might actually be running downhill. I'm not sure what's going on here. He's looked good. He can catch the ball. Obviously, they're going to score rushing touchdowns. If he comes back around to us, especially when we have these guys to build out the starting element of our running back group, I would love that. We're 9 picks away. He's already below ADP. I don't really expect it, but I would love it. We put Roschon Johnson in the queue. Also, he's someone the Bears continue to talk up. Now, this was a very good game from Khalil Herbert in week 4, and yet we also discussed how the weird play call on the 4th and 1 really hurt in the fact that you got a small back trying to get the short yardage play there. I mean, there are so many different ways where a player like Johnson could just usurp so much of that role. And if you make the case that the Bears are actually going to be not good, I mean, that window seems to have closed, but they could occasionally be decent, then I think Johnson at these prices becomes interesting as well. Colm, obviously, the receiver position has been very well picked over. The names that we're looking at by ADP here, somewhat humorously, Josh Reynolds. I think that to an extent is an artifact of pre.
I think that probably goes away with the return of Jameson Williams, but he has been getting fantasy points, so I'm assuming that is where the ADP is coming in from. But long term, I'm sure the Lions are hoping as well that just becomes Jameson Williams.
Yeah, we'll see. I mean,
Shawn is starring names that are, going to be here in a couple of rounds' time. So at least we'll have those in there. But this is going to be an interesting part of the draft where we'll see some guys who have fallen. There's not going to be a huge amount of probably risers that we're looking to target in this range, but we might be looking at players who have, like we talked about earlier, Shawn, maybe have had those couple of weeks where things haven't happened. We have drafted a couple of those so far, and the likes of a Quinten Johnson, but the running back options here could be potentially interesting. Algier going in the zone, the other player that you've added to the queue, Tyjae Spears getting some work in Tennessee with the Titans. So 1 pick away, Algier goes off the board, Charbonnet went off the board there the last 2 picks. We'll see what happens on this next selection, but for me, it's probably feels like it'll be a nice spot to get Johnson if he makes it one more selection here.
Yeah, and the position that we haven't addressed is tight end. And so the other kind of top pick for me would be Dalton Kincaid. His ADP is in a couple picks here and isn't necessarily projected to get all the way back to us. And he's one of these guys who could have a pretty big breakout over the second half of the season. You have to love the way the Bills offense looked like. Would you be comfortable with us reaching a little bit here since we haven't addressed tight end?
We are 15 picks below Johnson, though, if we did want to go that way. We don't go that way. We ran out of time. Shawn got me on the filibuster. Johnson goes on the next pick. That was, I think, 15 picks after ADP, which I think is an interesting spot based on how the buzz has been around him, as the season has gone along. It's not, I guess buzz is too strong of a word, but the word coming out from Chicago is they want to get him involved more. I do think with the way this roster's kind of been built up so far, adding Kincaid there does make a lot of sense. The other player, obviously, that's going in this range is Pat Freiermuth. Going to miss it. It seems more positive than maybe I had kind of hinted at on the Monday show. It felt like with the scans he was going to get, it could have been a little bit of a longer time frame. And then if we're looking at a bye week in week 6, you might get him back week 7, week 8 time. So you would be missing him out for those couple of weeks. But Luke Musgrave, Shawn, we have drafted 1 Packer so far. Have you thought much of the one thing I've thought is he seems to be getting open quite a bit, but Jordan Love just can't hit him on those seam routes at all.
Yeah, that's been an interesting one because he does get wide open pretty consistently, and then we've seen Love missing. We've seen Musgrave stumble and fall down as he's about to catch the ball. You get a little bit of a sense of why Musgrave, number one, has been a really trendy player because he's got the big body athleticism. And then number 2, why he also maybe has a little bit in the way of red flags because the results, again, not exactly there. Again, it depends on what your expectations are for a rookie tight end in that situation. Colm, I would have liked to have taken him. He does go 2 picks before us there. I think that Spears now, who is right at ADP, is really the only guy who looks interesting here.
Yeah, he does. And it is going to make it a bit tricky for us, with the tight end position as we move forward here. We may have to really load up on tight ends in those last couple of rounds to try and kind of piece together something if Kincaid doesn't get more work. So it's going to be interesting to see what we do here as we move forward. But the options there, as I mentioned, were Freiermuth or, reaching down a little bit for Njoku, who may be there at the next pick we have. Higbee goes off the board 1 pick after us. I would have been interested in taking that shot on Musgrave, but I'd like to get Spears there. The team, Shawn, so far is looking quite strong. It's obviously 2 at quarterback. We will need to get a secondary and potentially even a third option as we move through here. And I should have mentioned this at the start, but the same roster settings and scoring settings as Best Ball Mania for people who may have drafted in that. But it's Austin Ekeler, Devin Achane, Jahmyr Gibbs. And then we get Tyjae Spears, wide receiver. We have Jaylen Waddle, Chris Godwin, Quinten Johnson, Marvin Mims, Jahan Dotson, and then Dalton Kincaid at tight end. So lots of ways this can play out. Feels like after, the way we started, a little bit more focus on the running back positions in those early rounds. I think we've started to shape the team out. Obviously, there's question marks around Quinten Johnson, question marks around, Mims, Dotson. There's question marks around a lot of them. That's why they're available at those spots. But I think that it's starting to shape up pretty interestingly here. And we haven't drafted anyone, Shawn, I don't believe, with additional week 10 buys. So we don't really have to worry too much at this point because we can take those in, and it's not going to be a case where half the team's off on week 10. But we have an interesting team here. How are you feeling? 8 picks away to the next selection. How are you feeling at this point?
Good. We have a nice balance. You can see now why I really thought we had to go with Kincaid there. Number one, I think that he could end up being a top 5 tight end the rest of the way. Number 2, if we passed on him, we were going to be completely locked out at the position. And I don't really think that there is much, if any, difference between Roschon Johnson and Tyjae Spears, the player we do end up taking. If anything, I think I'm probably higher on Spears. So I'm glad that it sort of worked out in that direction. It is interesting because at this point in the season,
Spears feels low. That was at pick 137. Based on what he is showing us, and he's having some standalone value, but also the fact that if anything did happen to Henry, it feels like that ADP is incorrect.
It does. So, I mean, he's playing so many snaps and has looked so good. With Roschon, for example, you're expecting that without anything else happening, that he could win the starting job. You're obviously not going to win the starting job as Spears, and yet you have a little bit of standalone value. You've got all of that contingent value, and I mean, he's a better player than Roschon Johnson. And so from that perspective, I think all of those things are very encouraging. We have obviously a number of Dolphins on this team. If there were a way to work in a Ravens player, we could do that. We've got both sides of the Chargers-Broncos game. Colm, we're 2 picks away here. Pick 152. We look at the entire board and the top names. Firemuth does go. So in some ways that is unfortunate. We're looking at Kareem Hunt, Joshua Kelly, Elijah Mitchell, Gerald Everett by ADP. Obviously, none of those guys are really interesting in any way, shape, or form. What are you seeing as we think through this? We could take a Kadarius Toney. We could take a Tank Bigsby.
This feels like an area where you can, if you want, reach for a player. If there's somebody standing out there for you to make that reach for.
So you're saying it's time to take Sam Howell?
Yeah, I'm good with that. It's a round ahead, but I think that's okay.
Well, one of the issues that we have here at QB is that since the beginning of this contest, you've lost some players for value in terms of Kenny Pickett with the performance and the injury, Mac Jones with the benching, Jimmy Garoppolo with the performance and the injury. I mean, Matthew Stafford, somebody who is below ADP there that we could have taken, and yet he's got the same buy as our quarterback in Tua. And so unless you're really locked in to going with the 3 guys, I like the way that Sam Howell looked in week 4, obviously facing that ferocious Eagles defense. He played almost the perfect game, even in overtime there, right? He makes that brilliant throw on 3rd down as he's falling away, drops it perfectly in the bucket down the field at the sideline to Terry McLaurin, who makes a great play himself. And yet in a really kind of weird dynamic. I mean, it looked to me like he was probably in, right? Yeah. But the official's right there. He sees it. You got to have to go with what he's saying. Certainly not enough to overturn. We're not complaining about that call anyway. The defender got his arm underneath the foot. And if that kind of roll doesn't happen a little bit, then McLaurin almost certainly comes down in.
I've been very impressed with McLaurin, how he's looked so far this season. He's impressed me. People may have heard me make a kind of a click noise or a twitch noise of some sort. That was that it would have been nice if Bateman had potentially got back that Ravens element that we had talked about. The other player that's gone there, Shawn, was Wendell Robinson. Would have been nice to add to this team. His teammate Jalen Hyatt is potentially available. What way do you want to go here?
I actually do think that going ahead and taking some of these Kadarius Toney splash plays is the path. There really isn't another interesting name. You think about Wandale going off, the other guys. I mean, Braxton Berrios has already gone. Curtis Samuel is gone. You mentioned Rashad Bateman. That would have been good in some ways, and yet Bateman looks like he's going to be a massive bust, especially within the context of this Ravens offense. I mean, players like DJ Chark and KJ Osborne are already gone.
But we're into the 14th round, so I think 13-11 Bateman went. I think that makes him potentially somebody you could select here. Curtis Samuel would have made sense, to kind of add to the Howell Dotson element of this roster. But I think Toney is interesting, Shawn, and you did mention him in fairness a couple of picks ago. I'm going to make a shout out here, Shawn, to the tight end position, and can we add Logan Thomas to the queue?
Logan Thomas has looked good. He continues to take all of those cheap shots and keep on.
He is getting
ticking.
Some tough. In week 4, he gets another big hit, and it wasn't this one. I didn't think was a dirty hit, like it was the one that knocked him out of the game, but it was a physical shot. You're going to get that, and there's probably part of it as well with a younger quarterback. There's some of these passes that we are seeing that are, going over the middle or leading your pass catcher into traffic, which I think we're seeing more of that as well. That is opening them up to those kind of shots to the chest and head region.
So, Colm, as we look at our team structurally here, we have the 1 QB and the 1 tight end. We have 7 wide receivers. We have 4 running backs. That does allow, so we have the 2 quarterbacks with Tua and Sam Howell. Yeah. So that gives us the flexibility to take more or less best player available as we go. I'm a little surprised that Tank Bigsby is still out there at 152. He obviously has not been involved, but you're 1 play away from a very big role.
Or he can run into the center of the offensive line and stop.
Or he can also run into the offensive line.
But he's 20 picks after ADP at this point.
He is.
I think you mentioned best player available, but I think I'm happy to be done at quarterback at this point. If I think you're the same, yeah.
Yes, I don't think we need to go with another player there. If Tua doesn't get it done for us, then probably none of the very late guys are going to be the difference makers. Some other running backs who are available. We got Kendre Miller in there, obviously with the workload that Kamara just got. It's a less appetizing pick, and yet I think feathering him late is still... I mean, again, you have the one play away type of potential, and they don't have other guys. I mean, Jamal Williams, not really somebody you're that worried about there. Rico Dowdle is interesting. I've mentioned Keaton Mitchell a couple of times, so probably not a necessity at this point yet. Jahmyr White might be a little bit interesting. But Bigsby's still there with us 2 picks away. We've got a couple of Ravens receivers in Odell Beckham and Nelson Aguilar, who could be the 8th wide receiver. Gerald Everett was one of those tight ends, and another player with the week 5 bye. He would have been...
Anyone, Shawn, at wide receiver outside of those Baltimore guys that you're interested in over these next couple of rounds, or does it make sense to make that move at wide receiver here?
Well, I think that with these 2 picks, we can probably take one of them, although Aguilar still going very late. I think that Bigsby for this first selection.
Yeah, let's do it. Shawn, you did mention Odell Beckham. He goes 1 pick after us. I am kind of interested in Nelson Aguilar. He has kind of frustratingly so far this season because he's not on any rosters that I have in any situation, but he has been getting some pretty decent targets from Lamar Jackson, so I would be open to that pick. But there isn't many options. For example, Wendell Robinson went. We talked about that earlier. Hyatt, players like that. A lot of those guys that we were taking in round 18, 19, 20, they've now moved up into round 13, 14. So the options that are going to be available to us here are very limited. We are now at pick 184. Feels like a spot, though, Shawn, that we could dive into these tight ends. And Shawn has added Otton, Thomas, and Durham Smythe to the options here, and they are going right at ADP or Smythe going in the kind of next 2 round range. We have all the available options open, Shawn. We have the week 5 here again coming up for Otton if we wanted to go that way. Do we want to go with that and see if one of the other 2 gets back to us? Do we want to go with Thomas or Smythe over him?
Well, Otton has been an interesting tight end, and that some of the steps that people were looking for him to take, he has taken. He's not going to be a huge volume guy, but he does get a touchdown again in week 4. He gives us another week 5 bye player. He gives us a little bit of balance with that Tampa Bay attack with Chris Godwin, whom we drafted earlier. I think that those pieces all fit together and point in the same direction. And then for me, the other player who would have been really interesting there was Dowdell. He would have been a little bit below ADP again, not a huge deal at this area of the draft. And yet he might be the last truly draftable running back. And so if we didn't want to stick with the 5, but we did invest 3 picks in the top 60 selections at running back, you need those guys to produce. And so to have taken the tight end there, I think works for us, and it continues to keep it open for us to take a tight end from either of our 2 quarterbacks with one of the last 2 picks that we have remaining.
So there is a possibility that Thomas doesn't get back to us. I'd be very surprised if Smythe doesn't, based on us also having that quarterback. But maybe he goes to a team that is in sufficient need like ourselves. There's a couple of teams here that are drafting at this particular turn that have a 1 tight end build. So we could see them potentially both go for those reasons. But we are set up here, Shawn, at the moment. You mentioned the running backs. I think we can add 1 more running back, but I think we're probably pretty close to settled at that position. At this particular point, we have the 17th round and the 18th round left for our selections. I think 1 tight end. But have you a preference of which other position we could potentially target here? could be that Nelson Aguilar pick potentially.
Yeah, I think that Aguilar is a possibility. Clyde Edwards-Helaire continues to get touches. Latavius Murray is a really gross pick, but when you're talking about, we're talking about touchdowns, right? Yeah. And how that works, especially in a half PPR format, where the big games in many cases are going to be predicated on touchdowns. You get that little bit of a pivot or a balance with the Dalton Kincaid. You get some more exposure to one of the small handful of offenses that's actually functional. I think that pick becomes pretty interesting. I added Greg Dulcich to the list as someone that we could add in to the Broncos Chargers build that we have going here. So those would be some of the other additional names. I think there's a lot of flexibility. I don't think that we have to force the Baltimore element on with the Dolphins if we have guys who just have a lot more individual value.
Yeah, I agree with that. And, when it's a piece that is, it might, it could be the piece you need in Aguilar, but when it's a kind of a piece that may also get completely phased out when people start to get healthy, I wouldn't force it. But it may still be an option here, Shawn, as we move forward. We are 3 picks away. Those 2 tight ends that we mentioned, plus Dulcich, who Shawn has added to the queue, are available. Any thoughts on taking, if they were available, taking both tight ends?
I don't think that we need to do that. We've discussed how the 4 tight end build will definitely work. I think if we get one of these 2 guys that we like, and that's almost certainly going to be an option here. I mean, Logan Thomas has looked very good. I think when you add Logan Thomas as a touchdown threat to go with Jahan Dotson, to go with Sam Howell, that rounds that portion of the build out very nicely. So probably a 4th one wouldn't be necessary. Latavius Murray does make it here. Colm, when you think about getting that 6th running back and getting the touchdowns, that seems like a pretty easy pick.
I'll let you do it since you've built it up. I want Logan Thomas. That's what I want. We have 8 picks to go, Shawn. The countdown is on. I guess what you're going to tell me, it doesn't matter which tight end we get as long as we get one of them.
No, I think Logan Thomas is a much more dynamic player, more involved in the offense, a better athlete, a bigger touchdown threat. We have a greater need to put another commander on here. I mean, you say that. I mean, just getting
I think actually looking at it now,
offense is
if Silent Race doesn't take Logan Thomas with these 2 picks, he has a 2 tight end build going here. There's a 1 tight end team drafting before us, so we could be in trouble with TC Broom. So we'll see what happens.
Jeremy Smythe, somebody who obviously on the field a lot for the Dolphins. He hadn't been that involved in weeks 2 and 3. He does catch all 4 of his targets in the blowout loss in week 4. Thinking back to that Murray selection, he's not necessarily going to get this too much of the time, but one of the things you do note is that, he even had more targets than James Cook in week 4. I wouldn't be worried at all about James Cook usage. He gets the touchdown in week 4 that we've been looking for. And I mean, obviously you're not going to burn up your small running back in a game where you take a big lead early. A lot of guys getting rested and having the snap counts adjusted as a result in that one. Colm, Tyler Conklin goes here. Hayden Hurst still available for the Carolina.
I think Hayden Hurst and Juwan Johnson are great picks here if TC Broom wants them. Do you think it's TC Broom or do you think it's TC Bromy? What are you thinking? TCB Ohm? What are you thinking it is?
I don't know. Either way sounds really cool.
So here is the decision point, Shawn. Has it all worked out? Is Logan Thomas going to make it back to us? This is the 1 tight end team. Shawn, tell the listeners what happened.
They did select Logan Thomas. So, Colm, we have Smythe, we have Dulcich, we have Okonkwo.
How are we looking out to the Dolphins on week 10? I think we only have Dolphins for week 10. If we only have Dolphins for week 10, I think we...
Yeah, we don't have too much of an issue at all with buys. We do have Kadarius Toney, but we're golden to go with another Dolphin here that'll be
the one thing I like about him, too, he is out there a lot. And the problem we've had with the Broncos is we kind of have a thing, Shawn, with Broncos tight ends that they don't be out there as much as we would want them to be over the last couple of seasons.
Well, I mean, the scrubs are out there a ton, and they're going to be vulturing touchdowns. The receiving tight ends are going to be on the bench, and that doesn't seem to matter too much which coaching staff you're talking about. Colm, there are a few picks remaining for our competitors, but let the listeners know what our team looks like.
So Austin Ekeler in the first round, Jaylen Waddle, Achane, Tua, Jahmyr Gibbs, Chris Godwin, Romeo Dobbs, Quinten Johnson. This was our little wide receiver run, Marvin Mims. Then we added Jahan Dotson. I think Dotson, Shawn, in the 10th round should be very appealing to people drafting. Then we added Dalton Kincaid, who is a big swing for potential upside this season. Obviously, as we finish it out, you're looking for those rookies to come on as the season goes along. Another one of those, Tyjae Spears, Sam Howell, Kadarius Toney, Tank Bigsby. And then we have Cade Otton, Latavius Murray, and Durham Smythe. So we're loaded up on those Dolphins, one of the best offenses in the entire league, obviously. And I think, Shawn, we're set there pretty nicely with the Sam Howell Dotson side of things and then what we've done with the Dolphins. And again, like we tend to do with all our teams, it is loaded with rookies and youth. There is a few veteran players in there, the likes of Chris Godwin, but and obviously an Austin Ekeler, but I'm pretty happy with how the team has turned out. And again, there's always those final touches that you think, oh, we really need this player, or we really need that player. There's a few players as we went through that I was disappointed to miss out on, but sometimes those aren't the players you need, and the players that you end up taking are going to serve you well. So how are you feeling now that we've done and dusted this roster? Has it a shot at the $30,000 top prize?
Oh, definitely. We have the guys, right? We have the horses. We have the big time athletes and stars. You'd love to have been able to get a Baltimore Ravens player to round that portion of that. You would have loved to have gotten a San Francisco 49ers player. By the time that we got to the Dotson and Howell portions of the team, obviously the 49ers are long gone. Those guys have gotten off to a great start. You have Brandon Ayuk and Deebo Samuel going at 305 and 306 in this draft. The player you would have been able to get later was a George Kittle. He goes in round 6. That was around where we took Chris Godwin, who has that week 5 bye. Christian McCaffrey right now, the overall 101. So it's going to be difficult to get to those specific players. Everything else about the way that this roster works and looks, I really like.
Yeah, I think it's a real fun one with how it has played out. And, for just a jump in before we start recording, hit the record button and see how things go. It was a lot of fun to do. People are probably wondering, because we didn't go through it for the audio side of things, for who is in that first round. Shawn mentioned Christian McCaffrey, the 101, Jefferson, the 2, Tyreek Hill, Bijan Robinson, Travis Kelce, Jamar Chase, Stephon Diggs, Austin Ekeler, Tony Pollard, Keenan Allen, AJ Brown, Devontae Adams. The second round, I'll just go through round 2 and then we'll leave it at that. But Kenneth Walker, Amon-Ra, Cooper Kupp, CeeDee Lamb, Jaylen Waddle, Devontae Smith, Chris Olave, Saquon Barkley, Puka, Derrick Henry, Josh Allen, Calvin Ridley. Guess I'm a little bit surprised that Ridley's still going as high as he has at this particular point. The other players, Shawn, that are probably standing out looking through that particular list is probably, it's 4th running back off the board. Pollard seems a little bit maybe high there. And then how have you felt? We haven't talked much about Kelce, but how have you felt with Kelce's kind of output through those first 4 weeks of the season based on where he's still going here at the 5th slot?
Yeah, he hasn't been nearly the impact player that he was a season ago. I think you can chalk a little bit of that up to the injury, a little bit up to increased defensive attention because the wide receivers are playing so poorly. That's a little bit of a double-edged sword, right? Where when the receivers are as bad as they are right now or making that little impact, then Kelce is going to be the focal point, both for Patrick Mahomes, but also for the opposing defense. And in an individual game scenario, that can play out for like 15 targets, or it can mean that he's being double, triple teamed. And you get a game like what happened with the Jets, where Patrick Mahomes has to run a little bit more than he prefers to do in the regular season, or the running environment is so favorable that Pacheco and even players like Edwards-Helaire can make some hay on the ground. So I wouldn't be drafting Kelsey that early, but one of the things that really does jump out here is that despite the big explosion from the Dolphins in week 3, despite the extremely impressive performance from the Bills in week 4 that just completed, it's maybe a little bit surprising. You think about last year during these resurrection drafts and just how early those quarterbacks were going. As things have started to separate a little bit in the last couple of weeks.
They were going earlier than this in the Best Ball Mania.
Yeah, it's surprising that Josh Allen is dropping below players like, well, I mean, maybe like the player that we drafted in Jaylen Waddle. We certainly can't exempt ourselves. One of the things that you end up always, one of the things that I would say here is that never regret having a guy go right in front of you. You have to be prepared to make the next pick. What appear to be tier breaks in many cases turn out not to be. Ben and I were in a draft where we were desperately hoping that a different player would fall to us, and instead we got A.J. Brown. And I mean, A.J. Brown right now looks like he's going to outscore that. You can go time and time again where the player that you were disappointed to miss on ends up being a landmine, and the player you got instead is a league winner, and vice versa, right? But I do think that there's a pretty big tier break between where CeeDee Lamb goes one pick ahead of us in round 2, and then what we're looking at there in terms of Waddle, Smith, and Olave. I mean, I think you could really easily consider Josh Allen or Jalen Hurts right at that point. Certainly Patrick Mahomes in the early 3rd is a pick that works. I mean, how much of his value is going to be mitigated by the receiver play versus, could he end up giving you some additional rushing value that would balance that out? Because we know that he's going to still play fine. The Chiefs are going to win games. He's going to discover ways to create passing touchdowns. When you think about some of the names that are going ahead of those guys, I mean, Puka is still very fun. I think that that's a very justifiable pick, but risky when you have Cooper Kupp coming back. Certainly Saquon Barkley in that offense with an injury. I mean, that's a tough pick. Derrick Henry in a broken Tennessee offense. I mean, he's coming off of a game where he looked better. He throws a touchdown pass, but that's a really tough pick. Calvin Ridley has been like the 3rd option for the Jaguars to go at the 212. I mean, that's a tough pick. The Seattle Seahawks passing game looks like an absolute train wreck. Geno Smith was awful last night. I mean, the Seahawks win easily, right? And we love is probably a strong word. We like Geno Smith. He was good for us last season. He's a solid NFL starter, but he's been completely incapable of unlocking the trio of receivers. And you think, well, maybe you guys are just too high on JSN. Maybe that's the case, but DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett should look better than. I mean, those guys have also not dominated. I think that that's a really strange pick with number 1, the quarterbacks, with number 2, Brandon Ayuk still available there, with DeAndre Swift, with Devin Achane. I think that those guys in the middle of round 3, in terms of that stretch of Ayuk, Swift, Achane, and Andrews, probably more dynamic, at least in terms of how I'm looking at it, than the players from, say, like 207 to 302.
I think it's going to be very interesting to see how this looks even in 2 to 3 weeks' time as things shift very quickly. Not as much of, we did mention that wide receiver did dry up in this, but not as much of the traditional Best Ball Mania avalanche for the wide receiver position. So jump in, have some fun in these. If you are playing over at Underdog, you can use code RotoViz to get yourself a 100% sign-up bonus up to $100. If you want to jump over to RotoViz and use the tools, get all the articles, all the content, you can use the code RV Radio 2023 at checkout to be able to get yourself a 10% discount off a RotoViz NFL pass. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on Twitter at @OverToMartin. My co-host is Shawn Siegele. Check out all of his work up on rotoviz.com. And until we are back, have a good one.